more because the younger one got already. So
Let's sit over here.
Well, good morning, everybody. What a good turnout. Today you're going to be educated again by a great educator, by the way.
I know.
This young lady who's going to be doing this class, matter of fact, she worked with me when she was a teenager, right?
16.
You were 16 years old. Wow.
What does that make you, Chuck?
That makes me old. That makes me real old, Kate. All right, well, before we get started with the class, quickly, we're going to go through buyers' wants and needs, and then we'll start our class. So this morning, do we have any new listings coming up or anything that you'd like to bring up? Hey, Corbell.
I have the Niles Trees Townhouse, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bath. It's listed at $988,888. It's 1,440 square feet, 2-story, 2-car garage, inside laundry. Seller is retiring and moving out of the area. Will be open on Sunday, 1 to 4. And like to see an offer.
Okay,
Thank you.
you bet. Anybody else? Any new listings?
I may
But-
have townhouse coming up in Foster City.
Foster City.
Yes, 2 bedroom, 2.5 bath.
Okay. You have a price range approximately?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Foster City. Okay.
I had a call yesterday with Scott Maxwell. He's with Keller Williams Advisors. He lives in Fremont. He has an Irvington coming, and he told me to talk about it for him today. It's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, and it'll be on in early February. If anybody's looking for a single-family 4-bedroom in Irvington, hit me up and I'll pass on his contact. I'm not sure if it's South Park. He said Irvington. So don't know. So if you're interested in a single family in Irvington, hit me up and I'll pass on his contact information to you.
Okay. Anybody else? No listings coming up? Nothing? Wow. I will be having a listing coming up probably the end of February. It'll be a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It's a blind, you can't get through it, so it's a non-through street. Above the hospital in Castro Valley, great school district. It's going to be somewhere in the 1.2 to 1.3, just under 1,900 square feet.
That seems low.
Could be more. It belongs to my son.
How's the ER there?
I'm sorry?
How's the noise?
How's the noise?
Yeah, from the ER?
No noise. He's up the hill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Very, very quiet in there.
How big is the house?
Just under 1,900 square feet.
Which city? 2 stories?
Single story.
Where is he going?
Single story corner lot, 2-car garage. Where's he going?
Yeah.
Brentwood. Brentwood. He wants a newer home, bigger home. Oh, okay, whatever. Don't make any money off him, but that's okay.
You don't make any money.
Okay, no. And I'm gonna have you be the lender for him, by the way.
I am so excited for you.
Good. Yeah, that'll be good. Okay, anybody else? And here's an interesting comment that I read regarding Maria. Maria, you put something on Instagram or something, Facebook, that you gave up everything and went to Tijuana? Is that right?
It is correct.
It's a true story.
It's a true story.
Tell it quickly.
And when it was exposed by Stephen Evelyn and asking if anybody have ever just go up or sell everything and just go up without a plan in life. Well, that was me when I was 16 years old. I left home, I changed my dad used to give us for birthday presents, like silver coins. And he got himself like, they call centenary, those big coins.
Mm-hmm.
And I exchanged, that's how I paid for my ticket to Tijuana because I didn't ask for permission to leave my parents, wouldn't even approve it. And that's how I ended up here.
Very good. That was an interesting story.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised what people read, huh?
Yeah, we all have a story.
Okay.
That's for sure.
Coming up, we have our next office meeting will be next week on the 23rd at 10 o'clock. There's going to be manager training. That's going to be me at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. of the new agents especially. This is going to be primarily for the newer agents. If you want to come, you're welcome. How many new agents are going to be available at 1 o'clock next week, next Tuesday? Raise your hand. I got one.
Next Thursday or Tuesday?
Next Tuesday, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 7 of us. Okay. We're going to do something different. We're going to actually write a contract. I'm going to give you that assignment. We're actually going to write a contract.
Write one on my listing.
You can do that. We can do that. Sure. Give me. I'll just take the copy of your listing agreement, and I'll have them do that. Anyway, that's going to be our session. So be prepared. All right. Now let's move on. Melrose is giving me the hands. The hands. That means I better move on. All right. At this point, I'd like to introduce Doreen Roberts. Who don't know Doreen, she's also a past president of Bay East. She is wonderful, very knowledgeable. And thank you, Doreen, for being here.
Doreen is our professional standards guru, queen, king, everything. That's her. Yep.
You should have been an attorney, right?
Yes, and should have been.
This is a small enough room. Is there anyone who can't hear me?
Well, the thing is, they're recording you.
Oh, well. I can hear
You
you.
could,
It can pick me up.
tell you what, if you just leave it here in front of you.
Yeah, it's just, I find those annoying. All right, so the topic of buyer representation agreements is a huge one, and it could be divided into all different segments. Melrose originally, there was something at the association December 5th where that was kind of the topic at the big event, and I guess that was the day that you had already had somebody scheduled here, so your group could not go and see that, and she was disappointed, and I said, well, let's bring it to your group. So basically what they did is kind of divide the topic into various things. We're not going to get into several of the segments. For example, this is not going to be a legal update by no means. I can summarize that simply, it's a mess and it's not over. But the reality is, it's a good thing. I've often said, in fact, I was here some years back, and we did a buyer representation agreement presentation. And I said then, years ago, and I don't know, besides Jerry and Chuck, how many other people were here 40 years before 40 years? Okay. So when they were young pups in the industry, I'm 37 years, and that's just about the time it was changing. But prior to that, it's an odd concept, but everybody worked for the seller. A buyer's agent was considered a sub-agent of the seller. And so it made sense. The listing agent negotiated the commission for the transaction. And if he sold, if I say they, you know what I mean. If they sold the property, they kept the commission. If they had another agent involved, they shared the commission in some way. And that was because they were sub-agents. Nobody represented the buyer. The buyer had no specific representation. But it wasn't until the mid-'80s that the Federal Trade Commission did some research into it and found that buyers did not realize that. Buyers, of course, assumed that who was representing them, who was helping them write a contract, actually represented their best interests. But the reality was that there was this holdover from the olden days when everyone was sub-agents. So it's at that point that they introduced the agency disclosure requirement, which is right around the mid-'80s. That's when I got into the business. That allowed a buyer to have separate representation. And so, of course, now we have buyer, all of those things different. But it never changed our compensation. Our compensation remained exactly the way it was, archaically, where we have the listing agent negotiate the transaction commission for the entire transaction. And in recent years, we have people who can't negotiate their way out of a paper bag. And so they end up negotiating or giving away the transaction at the beginning, and then there was hardly any commission left over. It's been a mess. And as the buyer's agent, we've been kind of at the mercy of whatever the listing agent was willing to offer in the MLS. and it's been difficult and confusing and all of those things. I believe that we are heading to the direction where it will be severed, where buyers where listing agents and buyer's agents will negotiate their commissions separately with their own client. I think it's the best thing that can happen in our industry, that it's definitely going to improve a lot of things. For example, it's going to eliminate the problem with procuring costs. Right now, we have buyers out there where people kind of stumble onto a buyer at an open house, and all of a sudden, they want to work with that buyer, and it's very loosey-goosey anyway, who's representing who, and it ends up in a lot of confusion. We have what's called procuring cause hearings quite frequently, where two people, agents, are fighting over the same buyer, only to find out that the same buyer is playing the agents, two sides against the middle. The buyer is using agent A and agent B at the same time, and they don't even know about each other. And what happens is they finally get into a hearing, and they find out that both agents did exactly what they were supposed to do. Neither agent stepped on the other toes. The buyer was literally playing both sides against the middle. And when they finally found the right property that they were really interested in, then the buyer had this little game going back and forth to say, who's going to give me the most money back? Let's play the rebate commission thing. And so they go back and forth till one of the agents beat out the other one without even realizing that they were dealing with another agent on another side. And so then the buyer goes with that particular agent only to leave the other agent out in the, what happened? They had no idea. So they file a procuring cause claim against the other agent. We get into a hearing, and it gets discovered that the buyer, who's not there, the buyer doesn't have to be there, the two agents are there, and they find out that they were basically played on both sides. So somebody wasted a lot of time and energy on that. Those things would not be possible if everybody was using buyer representation agreements. This has been something that for me for many, many, many years. And we've gone through several ideations of the buyer representation agreement. I still want to call it a buyer-broker agreement. Now they're called buyer representation agreements. So if I say buyer-broker, I really mean buyer representation agreement. The other one is just kind of ingrained in my head. But for many, many years, I've used the buyer representation agreement. The very first time I decided to use that was, I had a buyer that I was working with, and we were showing property. But every time I walked into a listing, the agent seemed to know who my buyer was. Oh, hi Linda, how you doing? Did you ever find something? Everybody knew my buyer. I realized I had the slut of buyers. She had been with everybody out there. And I'm thinking, am I going to just be another notch in Linda's belt? No, I'm not going to do that. Linda's either going to commit to work with me, and I'll work with her, or I'm not going to continue working with Linda. So I remember I brought it out, because I'd already been showing her property and such. So at a property we were showing that evening, I remember it was a vacant house and a kitchen. I had the buyer representation agreement with me, and I talked about it. She signed it. We ended up continuing to work together, and I ended up closing that transaction with her. But that was the beginning, and since then I've never done a buyer without a buyer representation agreement, and that includes my own sister. People are shocked. Why would you put your own sister in a buyer representation agreement? Like, don't you trust your sister? Of course I trust my sister. But there are many benefits to being in a buyer representation agreement that I wanted my sister to have the advantages of. Some of those include not being bothered by other agents. Just like sellers, we all know that we don't bother another seller because they're in an exclusive representation agreement. And if we were to interfere with that arrangement, it would be a violation of Article 16. So we don't do it. But buyers are not protected like that unless they're in an exclusive representation agreement. And that was designed basically because of antitrust. Because you can't have an individual exclusive without an expiration date. That's why it was drilled into our heads when we got our licenses, that if you have a listing agreement, an exclusive listing agreement, you must have a specific date that it expires. That's because of antitrust. You can't claim a client exclusively in perpetuity. There has to be another time where that client or that consumer is able to be, I was going to say attacked, was going to be able to be solicited by other people. And so that is the reason it has to have an exclusive listing has to have an expiration date. And that's the same with a buyer. In a buyer representation agreement, you have an expiration date, just like on a listing. Now, well, let me ask, how many people, is there anyone using buyer representation agreements right now? Anybody? All right, Melrose is. Anybody else?
I used it once.
You used it once? All
And
right.
my former broker would not allow me to sue for the money, so I
Oh.
left the firm. The buyer did an end run around it and bought the house anyway.
Interesting.
So that was,
And that's kind of a rarity, really, when you
and that was
think
8
of it.
years.
Okay, good to know.
Anyway.
All right, so let me ask, what are some of the reasons that you choose not to use a buyer representation agreement? Somebody, give me an idea of why you don't.
I'm a listing agent.
Jerry?
Well, it's really awkward explaining it to the buyer, and buyers are very hesitant when the cast is very hesitant to sign it. And we weren't able to adequately explain to them why they should.
So there was
I knew
awkwardness.
why.
Yeah, but it was just awkwardness over it at that
And
time.
I would bind buyers to me, and I never really had a problem with it, because they would stay with me, because in my experience and what I
Sure.
was doing. And my value proposition came across very well. But, and I never lost a buyer, because I didn't have a buyer's agreement. But the fact that it was awkward to use initially and get them to agree to sign it. And I think the most difficult part is we put a commission in there that they're responsible for. And they go, what?
Agreed, I understand that, we're gonna talk about that. Did you have a reason?
Well, the same, what Jerry just said, that the hesitation,
Mhm.
because again, commission part, and then they do want the flexibility that, again, going to the listing agent directly, and if there is a supply and demand, right? So if there are more buyers out there in one house, how can I get it in whichever way possible? And if it is going straight to the listing agent, they will do that, no matter what anybody has done it. So my always dilemma was, and I was hoping that industry would make this as much of a mainstream as we have done with the sellers. You know, we have all the rules and regulations.
Good
Once
point.
we have a listing agreement, nobody can touch that agency. Why can't we just have the same and not call it, it has to be called the same way as sellers. And every buyer will, once the buyers will get this whole news out, which should be said it out loud to them, that once you have signed, and you need your own representation, once you are signed, then that agent will work for you. But maybe not spelled out the way it is right now, really pushing the buyer away. If you don't buy it from me, you will be giving me the commission. That's what's going to be a big reason for them not to sign it.
Well, your wish may be coming true. They are talking about, I think, in the Monterey CAR meetings, they are talking about,
February.
February? What did I just say?
No, you didn't call them out.
In February, okay. They are talking about making this a mandatory
Yeah.
thing, which would be good.
Then
But let's talk about what you were talking about, because that's how I've always approached it, is normalizing it like the listing agreement. Most sellers, I mean, is there anyone here who would take a listing without a listing agreement? Okay. So a buyer representation agreement is basically the opposite. It's for sellers, for buyers. And that is how I've always approached it. So when you go in and you're dealing with a seller, do you walk in with your listing agreement, slap it on the table and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, please sign this. This is my listing agreement. Sign it right here.
No way.
Okay, what do you do before you have them sign
Show
that?
my value.
And how do you do that?
With regard to a market analysis and also my marketing plan.
Okay, and so you sell yourself to begin
Exactly.
with, don't you? Sell yourself in terms of what you bring to the table. When there's what, 5,000-6,000 of us out in raised our membership right now?
6,600, maybe 6,700.
We lost 8%
1,000.
last year.
Yeah,
Member.
67.
67. Oh, okay, I thought you said 6,700. I was gonna say.
No. So, yeah.
Yeah, so when there's that many of us in an area, you gotta sell yourself. You gotta sell yourself what's your secret sauce? What makes you different? What do you bring to the table that's different? And eventually, you either sell them on yourself and you get that signed and then you go to work for them. Well, that's what I do with buyers the same. In other words, with a buyer, I have presentations, just like with a seller. I have it on my phone, but it's like on an iPad, I have presentations. Various ones, how I work with a seller, on pricing. If I have somebody who's really stubborn about pricing, I have a presentation that I created on that. Well, I have them for buyers as well. How I work with buyers, you know, and in this market, when you're trying to differentiate yourself, having a buyer representation agreement was a good way of doing that because not everybody was doing it. So you can kind of elevate yourself to say, as I respect buyers the same way sellers. Just like, and a lot of times the seller would have just finished selling a property, so it made perfect sense for them to be a buyer and sign a buyer representation agreement because they're virtually flipped documents. Instead of listing a property, one is listing the buyer, so to speak. Now today we're not going to go line by line and talk about the document itself. My guess is that it's going to change a dozen times in the next couple of months. I know that they're making tweaks and changes to it. And there's several classes. CAR has one that they have extended the free offer. I don't know how much longer that's going to go, but you should grab it for free. You get continuing education credit, and you don't have to take the class for 12 months after you actually sign up for it. So grab it while it's free, and then take it at your convenience, and you get CE credit on top of it.
What's it called, Doreen?
Oh, good question. Buyer representation agreement form, I think, is something along those lines. I bought it, and I can't tell you what it was. But it goes line by line and goes, what's that?
Smart Zone. In Smart Zone, you should be able to get it in Smart Zone.
Smart Zone. It's the CE, is that the same thing?
Well,
The CE
I
credit?
think it shows you in there, the course.
Oh, you're talking about the thing that keeps track of everything.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, just go online to this CAR thing. There's
CAR
advertisements for it. You really can't miss it. Tamara Suminsky also has a class that's out there on the buyer representation agreement.
We did that.
What's that?
We did that.
Oh, you did that one? Okay, because I like the way she did, not only on the line by line, but then she goes through and talks about your secret sauce and how to package that up. So everybody has to have your own thing, whatever it is. When I have my listing agreements, I was doing the 3 Ps: preparation, pricing, promotion. With the with buyer representation agreement, it was the 4 Es: evaluation, experience, exposure, and expertise, I think it was. At any rate, some way of bringing the buyer's your differences, your secret sauce to the buyer's attention in that. Now, one of the things that I used to always offer to my buyers is that I would not represent a competing buyer to them. You know, we always know that there are people out there. I've seen where I have a listing and I get an offer from one agent for 3 different clients. It always amazed me how they did that. What did they say to each buyer in between? What was that conversation like? But nonetheless, it happens out there. And so that was one of the things that I offered to the buyer is that I would not compete. Now, if I'm part of an office, which of course you can't guarantee your office isn't going to compete, but I, as your own agent, will not compete. Believe it or not, that really resonated with a lot of buyers. They appreciated the fact that I would be representing them individually. Has anyone ever met somebody at an open house or somewhere and you took their information of what they were looking for, and then you walked away thinking, I would never want to work for that person anyway, and you just ignored the fact that you took all that information?
Yeah.
Am I the only one? Yeah, of course, we've all done it. That's another difference, that when you're talking about a buyer representation agreement, you can't do that, because you're signing an agreement, just like a listing agreement. When you take a listing agreement, you are promising to use your best efforts to sell that property. You're going to do a certain marketing, you're going to do a variety of different things. You are promising whatever it is that you sold to them as far as your secret sauce. Well, the same is true with a buyer. You're going to talk about the things that you're going to do for them. So one of the things that I always had was a packet of information. Now, of course, this started long before. Now a lot of it is in links that I can send to them. But at the beginning, it would be printed things. There was different articles from Kiplinger magazine and a variety of Money magazine and things where they talked about the advantages of having a buyer representation agreement. So I would put a press package basically together to send with the buyer. If they weren't ready to sign, I would have like usually a 2 appointment beginning with a buyer to begin with. And on that first meeting, we would talk about what it would look like if we decide to work together, and I had like an outline of the things that we would do. And the first thing on that list was always the buyer representation agreement. And then the second meeting would talk about the buyer contract itself, where we would go over that, because again, one of my E's that I was selling was education. That I would give them the right education timely for them to make the decisions that they need to make in the transaction to begin with. And that was divided over the different elements of, or the segments of the transaction. So before discovery, before we would go into having inspections and reports and such, I would give them information on the reasons that we do that, what we're looking for, the do's and don'ts. You know, we're not going to nickel and dime our seller. We're going to be looking for things that are, you know, and of course that changed over the years to times when there was nothing we could really ask for. So then we would be educating them on the market conditions, what it's going to look like, what is our strategy, and we would talk about all of those things. A buyer wants to feel that they are an important element, that they are an important client, and not just one of several different things that, you know, you've got, you know, all these things up in the air. So in order to entice them to work with me exclusively, I needed to offer them what I considered value in the package. At many times there was different programs that I was subscribing to. Now we can get it through HomeSnap, where you've got that instant feedback so that they can have properties that they're looking at. But for the longest time I bought programs that through Baynet, I remember, was one of them that we did, where you could do this back and forth, you know, information, so that they would be notified as soon as a property came up. Now these are much easier to do, and I think HomeSnap is one of the best tools that is out there that we have for basically nothing extra to utilize in there. And so for a buyer to understand the value of what they were going to receive, it was important that I had that in an outline to begin with, so that they felt that there was some structure to this, and it wasn't kind of a loosey-goosey, we'll just do this today and do that tomorrow. I just do not ever let somebody just get in my car and we go out and see property before they have been effectively evaluated, before we know what their capabilities are and such. And if that wasn't okay with them, they weren't my buyer. And I knew that from the very beginning. I wasn't going to waste my time with somebody who wanted to waste my time. And are there buyers out there who want to waste your time?
Oh boy.
Yeah, if you want to waste your time, be a buyer's agent, because you can be a taxi. Basically, you are a mobile key opener, door opener, is really what it amounts to. Especially when they know that they're going to be able to use somebody else to actually write their offer. But that person has a full-time job and they're not available during the week, but you are. So they're going to use you to go see this property, see that property, and then they're going to go to somebody else to write the offer. Well, I wasn't going to do that. And so by having a structured thing, also give me a hint when it's time to be wrapping up. Okay.
That still happens.
Does it still
Yeah.
happen?
That's one of the greatest reasons to have a buyer's.
Yes, a buyer representation
Yeah,
agreement.
absolutely.
Especially
today.
especially in this day and age, and this is where I saw it happening the most in procuring cause transactions and such, is if a buyer is working with somebody, as I said, now they've kind of worked around it, they're not even shy about doing it, they literally work with multiple agents at the same time and just don't tell them about each other. But there was a time where they would at least work with somebody for a length of time. And then when it finally, you found the right property, then they would ask you for commission rebates. Now, commission rebates are lawful in California. As a matter of fact, the Department of Justice encourages them. Believe it or not, on the Department of Justice website, if you go there, they have calculators for the consumer to see how much they should ask from you, whether it be a percentage or whether it should be a flat amount. Go to the Department of Justice website and you will see exactly what I'm talking about. There's a handful of states that do not allow those rebates, and the Department of Justice are going after those states because they want the consumer to be able to have a negotiated cost payment for the services. That's why the benefit of where we're heading with dividing between the seller and the buyer, where you negotiate with the buyer the commission to begin with. Now, what I've done up until these last, periods of time was I agreed in writing that I would accept whatever was being offered in MLS, because that got over the hump that we were just talking about, was this commission thing, because it was so unusual to tell a buyer that you are responsible for it. But it isn't unusual anymore. Now it's going to start becoming more of a norm, because sellers, the conversation with sellers, which we're not going to have today, but that is a whole conversation in itself that needs to be revamped. We are all now on notice after these lawsuits that it is not business as usual how we're dealing with the seller on the subject of commissions. And so it is important that that is elevated, that is changed, so that the seller understands that they are in control of that and can change it from either the same as how they've done it and offer you the commission to split, or they can save it and hold it and wait for a buyer now to ask for it in the transaction. I know that goes against a lot of what we've always learned. You don't use the contract to negotiate commission, but that's between agents. Agents don't use the contract to negotiate, but a buyer can use the contract to negotiate commission with the seller. And that's now becoming more and more plausible. As a matter of fact, there's clauses into the new contract where if the buyer has a buyer representation agreement, they can check something that says that they want to ask the buyer or the seller for that commission to pay their agent in the transaction. So you're going to start seeing that more and more. There's no way of getting around it. If you are not changing your conversation with the seller, you're a lawsuit waiting to happen. I mean, you can see the wave of these lawsuits are coming over the country, and California is trying to do everything possible to stave them off and to protect us, and they're basically screaming, use buyer representation agreements so that you can avoid being in that particular trap of doing business the way you've always done it. Because if you are, you're not explaining that to the seller. Later on, if some sharp-talking attorney gets hold of your client, your seller, and says, have you bought a house in the last, and did they tell you this or whatever? It is a lawsuit waiting to happen if you don't prepare yourself. And so that, again, is a separate subject that your brokerage, you guys should be having conversations about what that looks like, what you're saying differently, how you're phrasing that, what things you're offering it. To me, I'm offering a seller the ability to withhold commission entirely, just pay me as the listing agent and pay the buyer's agent as they come up. So that means if you don't have a buyer representation agreement and you come across one of my sellers who chooses to do that, you're going to be in a mess because you never had that conversation to begin with. That's what I'm saying is you have no choice anymore. At this point, they're going to try and make it a mandatory thing, but even if not, the realities of the marketplace, you have no choice anymore. If you want to be a professional, you need to have that conversation to begin with. And the benefit of doing it in advance is that if they want, in other words, if the buyer makes their agreement with you to begin with, then you're not going to be held hostage at the end of the transaction for a commission rebate because you negotiated that at the very beginning. So if you decide whatever it is at the beginning, if they're going to say, well, gee, I'd like X% back in the transaction, well, then you know that your strategy has to include that when you make your purchase contract to begin with. So you're going to have to build that in, and that's based on the strategy that you have with your buyer when you sit down with them to begin with and have that conversation. Jerry?
Isn't that interesting if the buyer's gonna pay you the commission and they're gonna ask for a rebate?
Yes, because they're asking the seller to pay
Well, I
it.
know that, but.
And the thing is, we could get into the chicken, what comes first, the chicken and the egg. How many of those conversations have we seen online? Who really pays the commission? Is it the buyer or is it the seller? Comes out of the proceeds, comes out of the price. I've seen those conversations go around and around, and we could have an entire afternoon discussing that. The bottom line is that when you have that conversation to begin with and you get it solidified in writing with your buyer, you have the assuredness that a buyer is going to be more faithful to you to begin with. And in that doing, I've always told the buyer, if you go into a place, including my own sister, if you go in someplace, they need to ask you, are you working with another agent or in an exclusive representation agreement? That question you better be asking your buyers when they come into your open houses. You should not be just asking for buyers for their name and their phone number and contact information. There should be something there that says, are you working with another agent in exclusive representation agreement? If so, who is your agent so I can follow up with them? Therefore, you can follow up with that other agent to say, your client Susie and Bob Smith was in my open house the other day. I just wanted to let you know it seemed like they had some interest. I'm hoping that we can follow up with you on that or whatever. It is professional. That is how it is supposed to be in a exclusive agreement. That's what the Code of Ethics says in Article 16 is any conversations should be being had with the representative of the client and not the client directly. There's another game that had been going on for a while that a buyer representation agreement can prevent as well. I don't know if you heard this one or had anyone affected by it, but there are agents, and especially when there's multiple offers that are coming in, let's just give an example. I'm a seller's agent, and a lot of offers come in on a property. Well, you know, when an offer comes in, it shows, everyone wants to show how good their client is, so it shows how well qualified they are, nice packages that come in with that. So me as the listing agent, I don't say I did this, I'm telling you this is what happened. In my example is my client accepts one of the offers, but now I see this other client that is really interested in this listing, and because I work in the area, I have another that's coming up, a similar property. So I reach out to that other buyer directly and say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I'm so sorry that my client didn't accept your offer, but you know, I work in this certain area it sounds like you're really interested in. I have another property very similar if you'd like to work with me. Okay? That was possible without an exclusive buyer representation agreement. That would be blocked with a buyer representation agreement. Believe it or not, your buyer is not protected in a transaction without a buyer representation agreement. So for example, we've had issues over the years where somebody calls into the association to say, the listing agent called the buyer directly and told them XYZ, or asked them XYZ, or did XYZ. Unless they are in an exclusive representation agreement, we can't do anything about it. They're not exclusively represented. Therefore, they can be interfered with. Now, there may be something legal you can do, You know, if you go to an attorney, there may be some tortious interference with, you know, whatever. But in terms of professional standards, what we can enforce at the local association, there is nothing. If you don't have an exclusive representation agreement with your buyer, there is nothing that the association can do if somebody interferes with that client. So when somebody says you actually even use your sister in a buyer representation agreement, yes, I do. Because I want her to have all of those protections. It isn't, a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to use a buyer representation agreement because I just want people who love me to work with me. I want them to just work with me because they just, you know, love me and how I work or whatever. Well, my sister loves me, but I still want to protect it under Article 16 of the Code of Ethics. And so having a protection, like I call it armor of the Article 16 when they go in some places, once somebody asks you if you are represented, you say, yes, I have an exclusive representation agreement. After that, that should be end of the conversation. That should be it. Okay.
I ask every time.
Good for you.
I often ask, how many agents do you have?
Good question. Isn't that a great question?
Really quick.
Isn't that a great question?
Yeah.
Because you see these people they think they're smarter than the average bear.
Yeah.
They've got all the same abilities to look properties up and this and that and the other. And let's face it, every buyer out there is not meant for us. Just like every seller isn't meant for us.
So, but what do I do when they lie to me?
Well, if they're
And they
going to
can't
lie,
remember their agent's name?
if they're
or-
going to lie to you, is it someone you want to work with anyway?
Hell no.
Okay, so that's how I answer that. If they're going to be evasive and they're going to lie to you and that sort of stuff, it is not the kind of buyer I want to work with. I did the ABR course many years ago, so that's accredited buyer representation course. So I'm on that website out there, and I'm also part of several different groups online with for buyer representation. So oftentimes I get referrals coming in from people who want someone already to represent them because they're already savvy to that. So that's the caliber of buyer that I am looking for, is somebody who understands the advantage of that and is already looking for that to begin with. And if I refer a buyer somewhere, so for example, I've worked with them and they've decided that they want to work down in the Stockton area, when I contact that agent in Stockton, I'm going to find someone who's also going to put them in a buyer representation agreement, because that's what they're used to. They're a buyer who's savvy, they understand the advantage. I'm not going to just send them off to somebody else who doesn't care about that when I've sold them on the benefits of that, you know, to begin with. So that's different. Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Yes.
some of the buyer really wants to work with the multiple agents.
Then they're not your buyer. Then you're not your buyer and you have to
I don't
decide.
believe that, and some buyer do buy property. The reason they tell you upfront, for example, I have a client, his son is a real estate agent. He told me, okay, find me a deal, and if you find me a deal, it's a fixer guy. So I did find him a deal and he buy property. It's not about only buyer representative agreement, I do agree, but some cold clients and some even current clients you have, they don't agree to sign it.
Well, and that will be their choice
I
until
don't
it
like
becomes
working with them
mandatory.
because it's like a hit and miss.
will-
Sometimes you have to waste time to gain
I
share.
agree.
It's not like
You gotta
you're
crack
just
some
gonna
eggs.
get it everything on the plate.
You gotta
And then-
crack some eggs to make an omelet.
When they run around you a couple of times, you'll insist on.
And the
using
bottom
it.
line
Run over
is,
the buyers and stuff.
until they make it mandatory, there will be some who will not want to be involved in that. But again, just like as soon as somebody tells me, one of these investor people who come in and they're working with a dozen different people, they're not my clients. That is not something, that is not the market that I work in to begin with. So everybody has their own segment and their own, you know, way they do business and such, and you gotta figure out what works for you. What works for me is if I'm gonna work with a buyer, I want a dedicated buyer that I'm going to work with exclusively, and we're gonna close that transaction, and I'm not gonna be sharing them with 5 other different people. How are we doing on time? How many minutes? Well, 10? Okay. Of course, keep asking questions. I could talk for forever.
Buyer is always looking for a bargain.
Yes, they are.
Always.
And have we had the kind of market that bargains really exist out there?
No way.
But you
No
know,
way.
that's gonna change. As the market changes a different direction, that is going to change again, and maybe there is that ability to negotiate for them.
Bargain, I mean bargain on the rebates.
Oh, okay, well, that's why having that conversation to begin with is so valuable, because now that the rules have changed, now we have to declare with every transaction you do what the commission is going to be. We're familiar with that ABCD form or whatever it is, where every time you're putting a transaction together, you have to notify the buyer on how much that transaction is going to pay you from the seller to begin with. So none of this is a secret anymore. Things are wide out in the open. We are in a changing world, even as we speak. And that's what I'm saying, is explaining to that buyer to begin with how changing it is and how they have the ability to ask the seller now to pay the commission separately, which was not the way it has been. Now it's actually baked into the contract, which made it a lot easier. But you gotta have that buyer representation agreement. Now keep in mind the form has some advantages in it, and I'll touch on these really fast. One is that it is not exclusive unless you make it exclusive. And as you go through that line-by-line class, you'll find out that you have to check something off. When I'm talking about using a buyer representation agreement, I am only talking about using it exclusively. To me, it's a why bother. But it's like training wheels. If you can't do it any other way, do it then without being exclusive to begin with. Get your feet wet, get used to it or whatever, so you're there. The other thing that I could offer to sellers is whatever length of time we wanted to test the waters. You know, just like with any client, you want to find out if you're really meant to work with each other. You know, and in that conversation, you can find out by looking, when you're first looking at property, and you can do it for a short period of time. I've always offered, you could do it for as little as a day. And the benefit of that is that whatever you do in that day, you would be compensated for if that buyer goes away for whatever reason. So they can't just use you for a day and then go on to someone else. So in the buyer representation agreement, just like in our listing agreements, there's that safety clause that says upon expiration for a certain amount of days, whatever you put in there, if the buyer goes to purchase the property that you were involved in, that you introduced, that you showed them that property, that you would be compensated. So even if it's one day, you've got the value of that to know that you're going to be compensated, and they can't just use you for a day and then go. I've never had anyone take me up on a day. The smallest amount of time has been 30 days, but you can still do it. That's the advantages, and at the end of that day, if you decide that you don't want to work with that buyer anymore, then you're off. And if they do go for one of the properties that you introduced, but just like the listing agreement, you have an obligation to provide a list of the properties that you introduced on the time period that you worked with them. And I think it's 5 days that you have to give them that list, which I don't know, like I've always used the CMA, what is the one that's built into, Cloud CMA, that's built into our MLS stuff, because it makes such a beautiful buyer program to show them what properties we're going to be seeing. I usually would put that on because there's so much. I mean, each property can be like 20-something pages. So I would usually put that on an iPad so that they can do it and email it to them in addition. So that's a beautiful list of what properties you actually saw to begin with, so that you can prove or demonstrate, you know, what properties you actually saw with them to begin with. Is there anything in our last couple minutes that I haven't touched on that you have a question about or whatever?
One time I asked a buyer, who's your agent? It happened to be Carol Nishihara, who I knew, who had represented me before I became an agent. So I called her, she didn't even know her buyer was out looking, and the next thing I knew, I had an offer from Carol Nishihara.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, because she just came in on the sign. Most people do.
Yeah? And that's another education that needs to go on. You need to educate your buyers so that if they are going into open houses on their own, which is never a really good idea, but if they are, they're educated of what to say, that they are exclusively represented, so that that should end. And that's what I always tell them. If they have further conversation, please ask for their card. Now the agent thinks, oh, they're asking for my card. That's a good thing. No, I'm going to be after them if they end up doing that. So just understand that part, the majority here is education on your part. Education to the seller now with the differences in how commissions can be offered and how marketing arrangements or how marketing decisions on those commissions can be done. Buyers need to be educated on how you're going to work with them, how you are paid through either MLS and or through asking the seller directly to pay commissions. I think before too long, that's going to be the norm, the absolute norm. So we might as well get used to it. Question?
So what changed? You said this change just happened. What?
The
which
lawsuits.
law? No, so the commission, the seller is now going to be not paying the buyers anymore?
They have options. They
Okay.
have options, and they need to be educated in terms of how they want to do that. You can't just say anymore that it's, you just pay me and I pay the seller or pay
So
the buyer's agent.
Isn't that more confusion and
Sure.
more options?
We're gonna have a lot of confusion before this
So
gets
now
clear.
if this, all the consumer out there knows that this is what it is, the buyer can now also directly go to the seller saying, give me
In the contract, in the purchase contract.
In the purchase contract.
In the purchase contract, there's actually a clause that says, we're asking the seller to pay my agent, whatever it is.
I believe it's line item G3.
But you have to have a buyer representation agreement in order to use that clause. So you have,
But
would
that
have
is-
had to do that with the
But
buyer.
that
to
is
begin with.
already going to be there. If you're writing up an offer, the agency is already there with it.
Not agency. Agency has nothing to do with this. Agency is a requirement. What we're talking about is that new form
Yeah.
that you have there. The buyer representation agreement is not agency. Agency is a required document that's educational.
So-
It means nothing besides you have to do it.
But when the commission part comes, that only comes when somebody is writing up the offer, which means that agent is already in place, the buyer's agent, right?
Right, but not the conversation on what you're going to be paid. So in other words, if you're working with a buyer and you've not had the conversation with them about buyer representation agreement, and let's say it's one of my sellers, and my seller has decided that they're gonna wait and see if somebody asks them for commission,
Okay.
And so in my case, it might say zero.
Okay.
My client might be saying zero in that, and now that's allowed to be done. So what are you going to do when you go to show that property, if you've not had that conversation with your buyer,
Oh,
that
I
you need to be paid?
Oh, I see.
You need to be paid, and so you have that conversation when you use the buyer representation agreement. You say, I as your buyer's agent need to be paid.
So on the MLS, on the listing agreement, now the compensation will be zero? Rick?
Could be.
No, could be.
Could be, could be. It
But-
could be the same, it could be anything, including zero.
Okay.
So you need to be prepared.
Could be $1.
You need,
It
yeah,
used to be $1.
it could be, that was the lowest
That
before.
was the lowest
Which
before.
virtually put you in the same situation, let's face it. If it was $1 or zero, it didn't make you any better in the situation. You were left high and dry as the buyer's agent. So
has this
now,
this rule is already in place?
what rule?
The
new
the new,
No,
yeah.
it's what she said. Melrose will be at CER at the director's meeting. Doreen is saying, it looks like that's the direction CER is going to take. It's probably going to be mandatory because of all these lawsuits.
And these confusions, because right now, it's already changing for sellers. So the conversation with sellers, as I said at the very beginning here, needs to be different already, so that they understand that they have these options. Because it was sellers who were in the lawsuit. Sellers were saying, we didn't know what our options were. So they've got to have options, and you better believe there's gonna be some of them who's gonna grab at that zero if they have that option to do it. And they need to be notified that of course limits the marketing, you know, in terms of who might be able to buy their house. But it also opens up the possibility that a buyer's agent, you and your buyer, comes to my seller and says, we really like your house, but we'd like for you, Mr. Seller, to pay our agent X amount of dollars, whatever you guys agreed to in your buyer representation agreement.
That will suck for buyers agents.
Question?
I have a listing coming up just like that.
Oh,
And I'm so uncomfortable about it, and I had a conversation with Chuck about it. When you have a seller that's fully aware of all this, and they say to you, I'm not paying the buyer's agent.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I came to Chuck and
Well, they'll
said,
take the listing.
no, I.
Well, that's the
I-
option, that's one option.
Right, but this becomes.
This is gonna get more and more
It
comments, so.
becomes very uncomfortable because they're negotiating so hard because they know they can.
Yeah.
And then I, being one of the newer agents, I've been an agent for 20 years, but one of the newer agents with this situation, and I go put it on MLS, and you guys look at it and go, what the hell, there's no compensation.
Yeah.
It makes it uncomfortable, despite the fact that I said, listen, people are, as a buyer's agent, you still have a huge liability, you still have an obligation learning from you as it
But
pro
again, the
standard.
the
They
seller
don't care.
doesn't care,
They
and
don't
that's
care.
okay.
Yeah.
Because that's
Yeah.
the new way
Yeah.
of doing
It's
things when this is
so
going to get
uncomfortable.
severed.
Yeah.
But you could also ask them if they're open to putting in the confidential remarks that the seller is open, you know, to compensation for a buyer representation agreement or something. So as a marketing decision, but if they say no, they say no. That's on everybody else now. That's what I said. You have no choice. They are out there.
Well,
These sellers are out there, and if you haven't already encountered one, you're going to.
Well, and then if the percentage is very low that they are offering.
It's the same difference.
You say to yourself, do I split it? Do I keep it? Right? That those conversations came up in this
Of course.
conversation with the seller. You can keep it all. You can share it. You can do whatever, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my Lord, right? Listings are hard, but also being a buyer's agent, running them around, the fuel, the everything. And the thing that I learned in pro standards, especially from Doreen, is we have a fiduciary duty to each other as agents, to other brokerages, to other buyers, of being as transparent and ethical as possible. And so then it puts you back in that question of how do you
Yes.
how do you not be selfish and make a good decision for the seller, the buyer's agent, myself, the buyers? It's tough.
But isn't it the same
Let me
thing, though?
clarify. A fiduciary duty is only to your client. To everybody else, you have a duty of honesty. But your fiduciary duty is only to your own client. And so that is where when you're representing the seller, you do what is best for the seller in that situation. And then after a while, if they're not getting showings and this and that and the other, they may change how they're looking at the situation. But until then, we're in a time of flux, and there's going to be all kinds of these kind of issues and stuff coming up, and there's no set answer. Everybody has to be flexible and do your best to kind of work through these things.
But isn't this the same thing though? Like, when in the beginning also, I mean, currently the sellers are giving commission to their own agent, and it's agents, what they want to share it with the buyer's agent.
That's
So
the
it's the
old
same.
way of doing things, and it may not be that way for very much longer. And right now, we're in a transition stage, and that's what Lori is saying right now, is we're transitioning as we speak. She has a seller who's already saying, I don't want to play the same game we've already played, I want to do it differently.
Right.
So you as the buyer's agent, catch up.
No,
Because
but what
that's-
I'm saying is she can still do the same thing. Whatever seller is paying her, if she is feeling that she wants to now share whatever amount she's getting with the buyer's agent, it's the same thing.
But she might choose not to.
Yeah,
Don't
but then-
count on it.
Right.
Don't count on anything the way it was. That's all I can tell you is, don't count on anything. We're in a state of flux.
So Doreen, how would they write that contract? So if I'm the buyer's agent and we're only getting, it's a zero compensation to the buyer's agent, do we write our offer for higher?
There's a clause, well, yeah, that's a conversation you need to have with the buyer. But first of all, you should have a buyer representation agreement with that buyer. You need to have discussed with them how much you're going to work for to begin with. And then there is a clause in, what's that? There's a thing in the contract where you could check off now that says if you've got a buyer representation agreement, the buyer is asking the seller to pay X amount. Just like, how many times have you written an offer in the past, probably not recently, but in the past where you needed $10,000 for closing costs? Did you change the offer a little bit to compensate for that? Okay, figure it out. It's gonna be virtually the same thing. If you're asking for something back, you're gonna have to compensate.
Okay, one last thing, just remember that if you do not have a buyer representation document, and you see zero in the MLS, you better have it.
You're in deep doo-doo.
So one of the problems is, okay,
Don't show the property.
if the, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to point out. If there is a zero, if I'm a agent, so maybe I avoid to show that property. So it's not the best benefit from the seller. Okay, and another look is, if I'm writing an offer in.
I'm sorry, let me just stop you there. Can you not show that property if it has a zero?
Of course, we can
You
as an
have to
agent.
show it, even
Yes.
if it's a zero.
But there is an unknown how much they are going to pay us. They may pay me.
That's why
10,000.
you need to have a buyer representation agreement
I
showing
know.
what your buyer will pay.
I know, but the buyer, do you think that they will pay today's standard? I don't think they will.
You know what, I realize this is spooky right now, and there's a lot that needs to be done, and like I said, we're in the worst possible phase of this. They are working with lenders to be able to put those on for closing costs and all kinds of things. So for right now, we need to do our best to just work through a really uncomfortable situation.
No, but who is making these rules for these? Who is?
Seller, we already have.
No.
The lawsuits created the change in the way we did things. And I say it's a good thing. It's just that it's a bad time to go through it, just like any transition. Have you ever remodeled your house? You know that transition from the old kitchen to the new kitchen, how horrible that is? And it's like that. That's kind of where we're at. We're in a transition between the way we used to do things and the way we're going to do things in the future, and we're in a mess. So stay tuned and keep your ear to the ground so you know what's happening.
Okay,
Last question.
Wait, hold on for your questions, 1 second. I think Chuck wants to do a quick announcement, and
I do.
Doreen, if you have a few minutes, that they can ask afterwards.
Yeah.
So Doreen will stay for a little bit just to answer some questions, but go ahead, Chuck.
Okay, at this particular time, I want to give our condolences to Jerry Reynolds, who just lost his wife a few days ago. So, Jerry, our condolences from the Realty Experts family.
Yes.
So I know you have to go. Thank you for being here, and thank you
Yes.
for what you do.
Thanks, Jared.
Jerry, is the services public or private?
No, we're having a gravesite service, and anybody that would like to show up can. It's going to be on the 18th at 1:30 at Chapel of the Chimes Cemetery. Jackie was well known in the area. She was a dancer. She had dance studios here. She was the first Miss Fremont. No, she well known. And, it's well liked, I gotta say. It was absolutely a charming woman. I mean, very charming. We have 8 children, and she loved children beyond belief. I mean, it was sometimes very difficult. She wanted all these kids, but I'm gonna miss her. I miss her right now. I miss her a lot. And in the last few years, she had dementia, and it's been a real struggle. Dementia is the hardest thing in the world for a caregiver to go through. It's a long goodbye. It's just, I'm glad I came to an end. I hate, it sounds funny to say that, but for her, I'm glad I came to an end.
Those of us that have known you for so long, Jerry, we know that you've taken care of your wife for many,
Oh, I know, many years.
Okay, well, Jerry, if there's anything we can do, let us know, please. Okay?
One other thing, she was gonna explain how the lenders are already helping the buyers pay a commission, right?
Right.
Well, we saw it in short sales when there was no money to pay a buyer's agent. So there is a way to write it, and we've seen it, we're comfortable with it. It's
Just having to be creative again.
It's not a big deal. The big deal is letting your buyers know that you would like to get paid. And I think that sounds like that's what's uncomfortable, is that you're just not used to it. So.
And the buyers.
That is the hurdle.
So you just have to remove the fear factor. You can't be afraid to speak to your client because they will sense that fear.
You know, you can't even have your house sprayed for bugs without having a contract, right? Yet we expect to go into one of the most major transactions someone's going to do without even a piece of paper that tells you anything of your relationship besides writing the contract. I mean, quite honestly, it makes you more professional when you use those documents to begin with. When you have a bundle of papers that you give your buyer to begin with to say we're going to work together and under these terms and all of that kind of stuff. It's definitely something that will benefit our industry in huge ways if this, once it transits all the way through. Just like the kitchen's going to be beautiful once it's completely done, but it's that transition phase where you don't know where the mayonnaise is and the refrigerator's in the living room and, you know, it's just a mess right now. That's kind of the phase that we're in. It's more serious, like if you're working with, I guess, VA buyers, because they can't pay commission on that. So those are the things that, luckily, we have NAR, which deals with federal legislation and stuff. Several of these things are going to have to go through some rows of legislation to codify and to make things more clear in the future. But for right now, the beginning is that, like Melrose said, get over that fear factor, have that conversation. You can say at the beginning, I'll accept what's in MLS unless it's less than such and such. I mean, if it's less than something you're willing to work with, then you got to have a plan. And especially if you're going to start seeing these listings, because you can't avoid them. You can't say, I'm not going to show any listings that are below a certain amount. That's a violation of your fiduciary responsibility. Any other, okay.
Is it still now currently, because I know when I was representing buyers, and I don't anymore usually, unless they want to buy my listing. But I remember when I would set them up in MLS to send out the automatic email notifications. I never did tweak those. I just put in a price range and an area, basically. I didn't, tweak for how much are they paying. Can you talk about that?
How much they're paying, what do you mean?
For example, the offer in the commission to sales office in
Yes.
MLS, it's clear.
But you can't search for that anymore.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, that was one of the terms on something that came down on one of the decisions to begin with, is you could not search by that and it had to be published. And that is what then turned into how you have to use that form or something to notify the buyer on each and every transaction. But there is no way of searching for that.
Because in the past you could.
Yes,
and you could eliminate those that didn't have 3% payouts.
Huh?
Your buyer would never see them. I never did that.
No, that's something different. Right, but that's gone away now. That was part of one of the terms that the Department of Justice shoved down to begin with.
So is there anything that we should be telling our sellers in this market today about this sort of thing when we're taking a listing?
Yes, that's what we were just saying. Well, it's a conversation that you as a brokerage should be having in terms of what the options are and what each one, how it affects them. So if you've got a seller, a savvy seller who's been listening to all of these lawsuits and says, I don't want to pay a buyer's agent's commission anymore, like Lori's already got, then you need to be prepared for that, to say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that's a decision that you're going to do, and I believe that in the future it's going to be the way most people do it, but for right now, I need you to know that these could be some of the ramifications of your decision. it could prevent some people from seeing your property, because now we're looking for only buyers. So do you ever use that pyramid thing that shows the pricing thing, that the lower your pricing is, the more percentage of eligible buyers? That pricing pyramid, you know what I'm talking
I
about?
don't think I've ever seen it.
Oh, okay. It's built into the cloud CMA thing, and I've always
Oh, I
used
don't
it.
use that at all.
So it shows your percentage of eligible buyers that are out there. So just like if you had a seller who said, I know my house needs a lot of stuff, it doesn't even have a roof. The roof is wide open on top. What conversation would you have with that seller about their potential buyers?
They'd be only dealing with cash buyers.
Okay, and that they're not gonna get any loans or whatever. Okay,
Correct.
this is
It's not
similarly,
financeable.
this is similarly what you're going to have in conversation with the seller, is to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, there's going to be a limited amount of buyers. So in other words, and this is gonna come into play a whole lot more in the lower ranges of properties. If people are in the multi-million dollars, maybe they've got that extra money to pay their own agent.
Sure.
But in the beginning ranges where it's very difficult, it could eliminate a vast majority of buyers who would be interested in your property. And then you can ask them, would they be open to paying if the price was right? And that's where the negotiation comes in. Because then if the buyer says in their contract, because you've got a buyer representation agreement, the other agent does, now the buyer representation, the offer comes in and it asks your seller for X amount of commission to pay to the buyer's agent. The seller can say yes, no, or counter it. I'd be willing to do it if the offer is this.
Gotcha.
So then the offer comes back if the buyer's willing to pay that. It's just like if you were asking for closing cost credits. So treat it like closing cost credits. Like if your buyer needed $10,000 to close the transaction, how would you approach that?
Ask for a credit.
Yes.
Or overpay and get a credit back.
Yes, so that's exactly what you're going to do with that scenario, is to say, because, and this is the other area where it starts to get sticky, is in when you're doing price analysis on the properties, is because you're gonna have to pay attention to whether that property offered commission back or not.
Oh, exactly.
You know, just like in the past, and I hope they make it mandatory, in the past, they're supposed to put if there's any credits at the bottom.
Exactly.
So you know that the offer was this
Or
plus
how
those
many
credits.
offers.
Yes, it would be so much nicer if those
Critical
things.
information.
Yeah, critical information. It's going to be the same thing when you're talking about whether commission was done, because it is usually assumed in transactions, they look at the commission to know that X amount of that money that was exchanged was for commissions.
Exactly.
So if now a limited amount of that is, then it means that the property sold for that price without paying
Exactly.
a second commission, and that another commission might have been paid separately. So it's gonna really start making it difficult. Appraisers are gonna be
That's
more
right.
mindful. They're gonna be asking those questions and such. And you, when we're doing CMAs, it's going to become more important. We might have to make some phone calls ourselves to say, did you guys end up making, I see you were
I call
offering
every
0.
time.
Okay, well then that's
I call
good.
the listing agent, and then I call the buyer's agent if I know it, to see who's telling me the truth.
Oh,
When I'm putting
okay.
a CMA together, I gotta know the information.
Good.
Is it an arm's length truly transaction?
Good. Good, good,
Or
good.
not, but then some of listing agents, well, I don't ever want anyone to know.
No.
What's the big secret?
Yeah, but that's not
Not
considered
if the buyer's
public.
agent does, or the seller's agent doesn't put it in MLS, how many numbers of offers they
Oh,
want.
okay.
It's
Yeah,
not
and
required.
when it shows in, keep in mind, up until then, what the seller's agent makes has never been disclosed. Because it's not in the MLS, it's only what is being
In the
offered
end,
to the
in
buyer.
the beginning was, Doreen, you know that because we each got a copy of the
But that's on the
seller's agent.
final thing. I'm talking about in what's in the public MLS.
It does.
It only showed the CSO amount
So
ever.
do we have to show that now?
Yes, the
Where?
CSO is still in there that needs to be done, but it doesn't show what the listing agent
That's what I'm
made.
talking about.
There's nowhere where that has to be disclosed,
Yay.
because that is a negotiable thing just like anything else. And as I said, I think very soon that CSO is gonna go away entirely. So plan for it. Plan for that CSO to go away, and you need the buyer representation
Okay.
agreement. Lori?
You're a listing agent, you've taken your listing, commissions have been established, you have the listing for 90 days, for example. Seller's not privy to this situation. Seller comes back around, their best friend tells them, you don't have to pay all these commissions, this and that. Adjustments are made maybe prior to an offer coming in, or all of a sudden, the offers are coming in and they then say, we're not paying all this and that. And you already have a listing agreement signed. They're renegotiating their commissions.
Well, we've always had that potential situation,
True,
and you've
but
got
I
a
think
contract.
it's getting it worse.
You have a contract there that you can enforce, but I would say is that you need to be doing the better job when you're taking the listing now, because you need to be educating that seller on their options and what each of those options means for them. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you can offer nothing, but if you do, these are the ramifications. This is a marketing decision that you're making. So out of the pool of buyers that are out there, if you offer nothing, you're gonna limit it down to a very small percentage who might have their own funds to be able to do that, but it's such a small amount that we could end up not having any potential buyers. So would you be open for the right offer to come in? That's why I said I actually like the offer with 0 for me and letting them pay, so then they can negotiate, like we were just saying with Kay, is to say, okay, somebody asks, they negotiate, they come back. No one can later say that they didn't have their options, choices, or whatever. And right now, that's called covering my you-know-what. Because in this market, especially as an independent, let's face it, an antitrust lawsuit does not get covered by our E&O. E&O will cover the defense, but not whatever comes out of that. And so you don't want to be hanging yourself out there on that subject. You want to be the one that's educating those sellers, even if they've never heard of those lawsuits. You need to be the one that's educating them, making them aware, making sure that they're making an informed decision, so that later on they can't come back and say, well, I didn't know that, and my friend now told me, so now I want to change my mind. That means that person didn't do a good job to begin with explaining all of that. Your client should be able to say, yes, my agent explained all of that to me, but they also explained that if I did that, this is what it could mean for me. So I made an educated decision to offer X amount because I wanted the most buyers possible.
See, I see if the listing agent doesn't do their work educating their sellers, that the buyer's agents could potentially run into that problem.
Keep in mind, the people who brought the lawsuits were not buyers, they were sellers. That's where the problem was to begin with. It was with sellers.
They were attorneys.
Huh?
They were attorneys.
Well, or they had attorney, or whatever. But let's face it, those were waiving now across the country. I mean, there's several of them. They filed some new ones the very day, October 31st, those verdicts came down. New ones went through the system. So it's only a matter of time before look at how many things online right now, or on TV. Did you ever have asbestos or whatever? Call us. Did you ever have this? Call us. Did you ever drink the water down in Monterey? Call us, or whatever. It's only a matter of time before some slick attorney in here says, did you sell a property in California between these dates or whatever? Call us. Okay, that's true. It's just the way it is. So don't let yourself be a target. Make sure that you're doing the education to begin with. All right, I don't want to keep y'all any longer. We had fun.
Freaked us all out.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Doreen.
You're welcome.
Doreen, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. See, you didn't miss anything on December 5th. I brought it to me personally.
Can I tell you, last week we had Tricia Thomas here and you doubled the attendance.